Welcome to Brixham, one of Devon's most delightful seaside towns. Surrounding a historic harbour at the south of Torbay, Brixham is home to a beautiful blend of gorgeous scenery and rich heritage. And on this walk around the town on a wonderful morning, we'll not only marvel at the gorgeous views of the harbour, but we'll also venture further inland, navigating our way through narrow, higgledy-piggledy lanes lined by brightly coloured houses, while we'll also take a deep dive into Brixham's illustrious history, a town which has played a role in everything from the Spanish Armada to the Industrial Revolution and the history of the British royal family. All of that and much more is to come over the next half hour or so. But we of course begin our walk taking in a view of the tranquil waters of Brixham Harbour, the place around which local life has revolved for hundreds of years. Dotting the waters of the harbour today is an array of small pleasure craft and larger fishing vessels. In fact, this town is home to one of the largest commercial fishing fleets in Britain today, operating on the back of a local fishing industry which can likely trace its history back more than 700 years. Through all of that time, the harbour here has been busy with activity, but it was on one November morning back in 1688 that a rather different fleet made landfall at Brixham. The fleet came from across the sea in the Netherlands, and it was headed by a Dutch prince by the name of William of Orange. And his arrival in Brixham marked the first time that he set foot in England on his way to being crowned its new king. William's landing at Brixham, accompanied by an enormous entourage of more than 14,000 soldiers, was the key moment in what is known today as the Glorious Revolution, the very last time that England was invaded by a foreign army. But this was no normal invasion, and certainly no 1066. William landed here at Brixham and met no resistance from the English. In fact, just a few months earlier, the Dutch prince had actually been invited to invade the country by a group of 7 prominent Englishmen, who were deeply dissatisfied with the reign of the current king, James II. The Seven's main gripe with James were his perceived efforts to turn England back into a Catholic nation, the country having developed into a majority Protestant nation over the preceding century. And so the king was deeply unpopular not just with the elites, but also with the populace more widely. By contrast, William of Orange was a Protestant, and so the invitation let him know that if he and his army were to invade England, he would have the support of the Seven, and likely a wider sect of the English population. The landing at Brixham here may have been fairly simple, but the rest of the Glorious Revolution wasn't quite so glorious, and that's a story that we'll be picking up a little later on. Now, just in front of us we can see what looks like a big old pirate ship moored in the harbour. It's actually a replica of the famous Golden Hind, the galleon which was used in the 16th century by the explorer Sir Francis Drake during his momentous circumnavigation of the globe. But Drake's round-the-world trip didn't begin here in Brixham. He actually set sail from Plymouth, a little further down the coast from here. But this replica museum ship, which is open for visitors to explore, is a fantastic way to introduce us to Brixham's own prominent maritime heritage. Drake may not have set sail on the Golden Hind from Brixham, but he famously returned to England in this harbour a few years later, aboard the Capitana, a huge ship which he captured from the enemy during the Spanish Armada. That ship was then left in the care of Brixham's fishermen, who quickly raided its vast supplies of gunpowder and loaded it onto one of their own trawlers, which then speedily zoomed out of port and towards the Spanish fleet once again, inflicting even more damage on the would-be invaders. It's fair to say then that Brixham has had quite a few action-packed moments in its lengthy history, although today the town is best known for its impressive fishing fleet and popularity as one of the most scenic seaside towns in this lively part of Devon. We mentioned that Brixham is located at the south of Torbay, a large bay located about 20 miles to the south of Exeter, and which is also home to the major seaside resort towns of Paignton and Torquay. Collectively, Torbay is one of Britain's busiest summer destinations, But while Torquay and Paynton offer everything from wide open beaches to grand pleasure piers and a wealth of traditional seaside entertainment, Brixham here is a little different. There's no major beach, and the harbour here is where most visitors will come to relax and take in the sights. Because of that, Brixham isn't usually quite as heaving with day trippers as its sister towns along the English Riviera, and that offers visitors the chance to enjoy the scenery and learn a little bit about the town's history. Just here, for example, is another monument marking William of Orange's landing here in 1688, an obelisk unveiled by none other than Queen Elizabeth II nearly 300 years after the event. As we mentioned, we'll pick up the story of what happened when William of Orange made his way from Brixham towards London a little later on, because the harbour where he landed is today filled with other points of interest. Looking across the water, we can see colourful houses packed together overlooking the harbour. While beyond the waterside restaurants and other tourist attractions, we know that Brixham Harbour is famous for its fishing boats, which have dominated life in this part of town for much of its history. Brixham's fishing industry can indeed trace its heritage back more than 700 years. But before it began in earnest, the town that we know today was actually split in two. The area around the harbour here was home to a rudimentary fishing community, and an area about a mile inland from here was home to an agricultural community. Rather sensibly, the agricultural part of town was known as Cowtown, while this was Fish Town, where seamen would venture out into the waters of Torbay to take advantage of the plentiful stocks of fish. Now, there are of course countless other fishing towns and villages along England's south coast with similar histories, but Brixham is especially famous in the fishing community, because this town is the home of the Brixham trawler, a revolutionary form of fishing vessel. Traditionally, the fishermen of Brixham fished mostly in the waters of Torbay, close to the shore where their small boats would be safe from the harsh waves of the English Channel. But over time, this practice led the numbers of fish swimming close to the shore to decline, meaning that fishermen were forced to venture further out into more dangerous waters to find catches. However, in the 19th century, larger sailing trawlers developed here in Brixham allowed fishermen to sail quickly into harsher waters with less peril, while they were also built to be powerful enough to drag large nets behind them, meaning that they could catch ever more fish than before. With Britain's population rising fast at the peak of the Industrial Revolution, the demand for fish to feed the nation was greater than ever before. So the development of the Brixham trawler put this town at the very heart of the country's booming fishing industry. And it's a big part of the reason why you'll still find Britain's largest commercial fishing fleet here today. Now here, the harbour is separated from the waters of Torbay by a pier, busy with tourists walking towards a scenic viewpoint which looks out to sea. This pier is known as the New Pier, and it was built in the first decade of the 19th century as Brixham's harbour, fast becoming one of the busiest fishing harbours in southern England, was redeveloped and modernised. And today the haven in which boats rest is much, much larger than it once was. The historic centre of the harbour, which we've been walking around so far, is indeed home to a smattering of fishing boats. But much of the rest of Britain's largest commercial fishing fleet is stationed just on the other side of the New Pier, inside the commercial harbour, where fish caught in the English Channel are brought onto dry land. As we can see through the fence here, a dense group of modern trawlers are stationed at Brixham Harbour. In fact, in total, more than 100 commercial fishing boats, big and small, call Brixham home. But once they've been out to sea and caught a good batch of fish, boats return to the harbour and offload their catches onto the quayside, straight into Brixham's world-famous fish market. Fittingly, Brixham Fish Market is the largest in England by value of fish sold. More than £60 million worth of fish was sold at the fish market's daily auctions in 2022, much of it destined for fine restaurants across Britain, including the one right here by the harbour. More than 40 different species of fish are regularly caught and sold at Brixham's fish market. But interestingly, the vast majority actually make their way overseas from this Devon town. Approximately 70% of all the fish bought here is exported to seafood-loving countries in mainland Europe, primarily Belgium, the Netherlands, France, Spain and Italy. So, if you're ever on holiday in Europe and eating at a fancy seafood restaurant, take note, your meal may have come all the way from Devon. Of course, the busy fishing trade means that Brixham itself is home to a wide collection of seafood restaurants, catering to locals and visitors alike, and the majority are situated in the houses here, which overlook the historic harbour. Now, none of the buildings we see here were around when William of Orange arrived more than 300 years ago, but historic taverns like the Crown and Anchor are still home to a proud history. This pub is one of the oldest in Brixham, established nearly 200 years ago in the early 19th century. Elsewhere, fish and chip shops, ice cream parlours, gift shops and more open their doors to tourists, who don't just come to Brixham to enjoy the town's streets and its proud history. During the summer season, the harbour is the departing point for a number of ferries and pleasure cruises too. Some provide a handy waterborne link with Torquay and Paynton on the other sides of the bay, and others offer excursions further out to sea, where you can regularly enjoy sightings of seals and seabirds, and on occasion, dolphins and porpoises too. There's no shortage of things to see and do here then, and if you find yourself on the English Riviera, it's well worth making a visit to Brixham, whether as a quick day trip or even to stay for a few nights. But as you soak in the sun and enjoy the scenery, remember that this picturesque fishing town is brimming with history too, with centuries and centuries of heritage standing in plain sight almost wherever you look. For instance, overlooking the harbour just up ahead is one of the oldest buildings in Brixham today, the old Market House. It's believed to have been built back in 1799, although it may be even older. But it was traditionally used as the main quayside storehouse for fish caught by Brixham's growing trawler fleet at the time. As the name suggests, fish were stored, sorted, and then sold on at market. But over time, this one stone building eventually grew too small for its original purpose. However, today the old market house has been beautifully restored and repurposed as another popular harbourside pub and restaurant. The old market house occupies a rather prominent position on the harbour front, hiding behind it Middle Street, which stretches inland through the heart of town. Now, Middle Street, which slopes steeply down towards the harbour, is today well known for its quirky, offbeat atmosphere, home to a number of independent, locally run shops, which stand beside gourmet cafes, quaint galleries and more, not to mention a few delightful murals, which add a splash of colour to the street too. If you follow Middle Street further inland, it'll lead you towards Church Hill, where you'll find the historic All Saints Church, as well as the road towards what was once Cowtown, about a mile away from here. Now, we won't have time to visit Cowtown on our walk today, but we will be venturing up to the other end of Middle Street a little later on. But let's briefly return down to the harbour, passing by the old market house once again. This 18th century building may be one of the oldest in town today, but it's positively brand new when put in the context of Brixham's history as a whole. It's believed that the very first settlers here laid down roots at some point in the 7th or 8th century AD, establishing the distinct communities of Fishtown and Cowtown. Together, these settlements coalesced over time to form Brixham, a name which is believed to refer to a farm belonging to a man named Breock, centuries before the dense fishing town that we know today grew up. Now, the open waters of the harbour are rather spacious, but that roomy feel is a bit of an exception to the rule when it comes to Brixham's historic town centre, because tucked behind the buildings of the Strand here, and the rest of the harbourfront streets, is a complex labyrinth of lanes and alleyways, which weave their way between hundreds of houses packed tightly around the quay. Here, for instance, the cobbled beach approach burrows its way between the buildings, into a dense part of town lined by historic industrial addresses, former warehouses associated not just with the fishing industry, but mills too, which operated in the heart of Brixham since the Middle Ages. Although most of the town's buildings today date from more recent eras, just here in front of us, for instance, in white, is the beautiful Merchant's Loft, thought to date from the mid-19th century, This part of Brixham is a good place to get a sense of the medieval era town as well, which was for a long time a much smaller but still lively settlement. This street is Pump Street, and it takes its name from the fact that the old village pump, where locals would retrieve drinking water, was located here. Now this was long after the earliest Saxon settlement of the area, but long before the town that we know today took shape, and Lower Brixham, once Fish Town, would indeed have had more of the atmosphere of a village. Fish Town developed a little later in time than Cowtown further inland. The local fishing industry began in earnest around the time of the 14th century. But just like today, Brixham wasn't only focused on fishing, it was also popular with tourists and travellers. Now, medieval tourism wasn't quite like it is today, but Brixham, by virtue of its position on the south coast, was a popular departing point for those embarking on pilgrimages to mainland Europe, most often to the shrine of St. James in the Spanish city of Santiago. Mariners who owned ships at Brixham therefore made a living ferrying pilgrims back and forth across the channel on their lengthy voyages, and this helped not only to put Brixham's name on the map, but also to bring more and more seafarers to the area, laying the groundwork for the major fishing community that evolved in later centuries. Few people pass through Brixham on pilgrimages today, the busy seaside town now most popular with leisure travellers, many of whom will take the time to stop and have a drink at the New Quay Inn, another of the town's oldest pubs, opened back in the 1850s. Before it was a pub, the New Quay Inn was a loft where sails were stored, although according to one local legend, none other than Napoleon Bonaparte was held in the building in the summer of 1815, as he was awaiting his final exile to the South Atlantic island of St. Helena. Napoleon did indeed pass through Torbay before his final exile, although many say that he never actually set foot on land here. And so as good as the story is, he likely wasn't held at the New Quay Inn in Brixham either. Just up the road from the old pub, meanwhile, is a glorious view overlooking the harbour, the golden Hind replica standing out prominently among the selection of much smaller pleasure craft. More houses stand packed together on the hill overlooking the harbour, while in the very far distance, behind the fish market, we can see towards the buildings of Quay, just on the other side of Torbay. On days like this, it's no wonder that this part of Devon is known as the English Riviera, although the mild climate doesn't always hold up against typical British weather. Brixham Harbour was in fact devastated by a huge winter storm back in January of 1866, which sank a dozen boats, destroyed tens more, and killed more than 100 people. It was known as the Great Storm of 1866, but fortunately many historic houses survived the tempest and are still standing today. One of the most notable is the rather thin house painted in turquoise just up ahead of us here. It was built all the way back in 1736, and it's known as the Coffin House, rather interestingly claiming to be the only coffin-shaped house in Britain. The Coffin House also stands at the entrance to the Temperance Place steps, a beautiful staircase which was originally constructed in the 19th century, to provide a direct link between the harbourside King Street and Mount Pleasant Road further up the hill, where ever more people were beginning to settle as this thriving fishing town was growing in size. Today, these steps, which were beautifully restored in the 1960s, are among the quaintest features in the whole town, lined by an array of gorgeously colourful houses on both sides, many of which now play home to holiday cottages, frequented by the many tourists who make lengthy summer trips to this delightful part of Devon. As we discussed earlier, there are plenty of things for tourists to see and do here in Brixham, but a lengthy stay on the English Riviera means you can do everything from relaxing on the beach, whether at Paynton, Torquay, or some smaller coves closer to Brixham, to exploring the great outdoors, with hiking opportunities aplenty along the coastal path or on the wild Dartmoor, located just a half-hour's drive from Torbay here. Of course, a simple stroll around Brixham's town centre is also a great way to spend a few hours, because there's much more to the town than the harbourside area which we've explored so far. So we're now going to press further inland towards Church Hill, where you'll find the majestic All Saints Church, which is located near to the other end of Fore Street just here, by many measures the town's main street. Unlike Middle Street, Fore Street is home to a number of more familiar national chains, as well as a few more independent and locally run establishments. Now, in most parts of the country, this kind of street would be named High Street, but in many places in Devon, as well as across the border in Cornwall, the main street of a town or a village is actually named Fore Street. Technically, the name Fore Street refers to a street that runs into a high street, or comes before it. But in many cases, such as here in Brixham, it's become the high street in its own right, home to many of the town's main establishments. That includes this, the Old Coaching Inn, a historic Fore Street tavern which, as the name suggests, was once a coaching inn. Opened in 1790, the pub was originally named the Globe Inn, and it provided lodging for those travelling into or through Brixham by stagecoach. Now, Brixham, located on the coast, was more often than not the final destination for coaches which had travelled from far and wide, carrying passengers who were looking to take part in the town's booming fishing industry in the early 19th century, either taking up jobs as trawlermen or simply buying fish at local auctions. As we know, this period was Brixham's economic heyday, the development of modern trawlers turning the town into a major hub for the supply of fish across Britain, although fishing wasn't the only industry which brought wealth to Brixham at the time. On dry land, Brixham was also once a busy centre of rope making, closely tied to the large sailing trawlers which set out from the harbour. While in the lands surrounding the town, there were also a number of limestone quarries, iron mines and ochre mines, the latter making use of a red-coloured mineral found across this part of Devon. Now, ochre was particularly special because it was once used as a coating to protect the wooden sails of fishing boats from salty seawater. And that wasn't just for Brixham trawlers, but fishing boats all over the country, from major ports in Lowestoft, Grimsby, Hull and many more. Now, all of these ports, located on England's east coast, are situated directly across the sea from the Netherlands. And the truth is that in 1688, William of Orange never actually intended to land here in Brixham, on England's south coast. Some believe he was originally destined for Great Yarmouth, Colchester, or perhaps even Hull. The Yorkshire city was the first major city in England to declare its support for the incoming Dutch prince. But on setting sail from Holland, William's fleet met stormy weather, and they were blown way off course, all the way down the English Channel and towards the coast of Devon here. This unexpected arrival on the other side of the country, a good distance from London, where James II's reign was fast collapsing, put a bit of a delay to William's crowning moment. But over the following few months, he and his army advanced gradually across southern England towards the capital, eventually taking power with relatively little battle or bloodshed. But England was largely supportive of William and the invitation to invade already. The story wasn't the same elsewhere, with major rebellions to the Dutch prince's rule emerging in Scotland and in Ireland, and we'll pick up the rest of that tale in a little while. Here, though, we've reached the top of Fore Street, where the historic 19th century birdcage pub stands overlooking the town's main crossroads, where the roads from the harbour meet those heading inland, towards Cowtown to the south and Paynton to the north. This part of Brixham is home to a wealth of gorgeous, rather opulent buildings, few more so than this, the impressive Brixham Town Hall, which was built back in 1886, and which also plays host to the town's beautiful theatre, and the former market hall. Before this town hall was built, local council meetings took place in the old market house on the harbour. But as Brixham grew in size, it needed both a larger town hall and a larger market hall, giving birth to the grand two-in-one Victorian-era landmark, which still stands today. This street on which it stands is known as Market Street, and just along Market Street there also stands the rather large Brixham Library, while standing tall just behind it is the majestic tower of All Saints Church, the main church in the heart of Lower Brixham. As we can see, the church stands on top of a hill, which in tune with Brixham's love of sensible naming conventions is named Church Hill. We'll walk up to get a closer look at the 19th century church, which as we've seen is visible from a number of vantage points all over town, including the harbour, the church likely having been used in the past as a landmark for incoming boats to steer their way back into port here. But there's more to Church Hill than just one church. Here, for instance, we find the Smugglers' Haunt, a quaint hotel which points us towards one of the more clandestine industries of Brixham's past. Like many towns and villages all over Britain's coastlines, smuggling was once big business in Brixham, peaking in the 17th and 18th centuries as people sought to avoid ever-rising import tariffs levied by the government. Now, compared with more secluded spots along the south coast, Brixham wasn't the biggest hive of smuggling, but it was home to a community of rather creative bootleggers. Local legends abound about the ways that people hid smuggled goods from the eyes of the law. One man hid in a coffin to escape capture, while another dastardly band of smugglers took advantage of a local cholera epidemic by driving their goods out of town in a hearse, with a party of supposed mourners in tow, all in plain sight of the authorities. As far as we know, there's not much in the way of smuggling in Brixham anymore, but once upon a time, seemingly tranquil streets, like Higher Street here, could have been home to gangs of cross-channel criminals. Today things are indeed much calmer, with an array of very colourful houses, some even more so than others, only adding to the picturesque scenery of the town centre. But if we turn around, we can make our way onto Church Street, which, sensibly, is home to All Saints' Church. Fronted by the rather pretty galleon cottage just here, which was likely built before the church, All Saints is one of the most recognisable landmarks in town, and it can trace its history back to the early 19th century. Originally, All Saints' Church was built in 1819, but the church that we see today is actually a little newer, rebuilt on a larger scale towards the end of the 19th century, although parts of it do date back to the original church from more than 200 years ago. But for a town with as long a history as Brixham, a church that's just 200 years of age doesn't seem quite right. And of course it's not, because All Saints here serves as the main place of worship in Lower Brixham, which as we know was the focal point of the town's heyday in the early 19th century. Before then, the town had just one major church, the parish church of St Mary, which is located about a mile's walk inland in Cowtown. As we mentioned, Cowtown was the original centre of Saxon settlement well over 1,000 years ago, Fishtown developing a little later in time. And as such, it was the place where the first church was built, the current St Mary's Church said to have been built on the site of the original Saxon church. Now, the current church in Cowtown is a slightly newer one, built just under 600 years ago in the 15th century. And for much of Brixham's history, it was the place where people went to worship, whether they lived in Cowtown or Fishtown. Of course, for the people living down by the harbour, it became a bit of a slog to trudge a mile inland, and up a hill, to go to worship every Sunday morning. And so, as this part of Brixham became ever more populated, it was decided that a new church would be built within easy reach of the harbour, All Saints becoming the Fishermen's Church. The new church wasn't the only major development in Lower Brixham at the time, though. As well as the modernisation of the harbour, and the building of ever more houses surrounding it, in 1868 a railway station was built here too, just a short distance further up the hill from All Saints' Church. The station was primarily designed to provide a quick way of transporting fish from the harbour further inland, although passengers also used trains to reach Brixham and the south of Torbay. But unfortunately, the railway was relatively short-lived. Brixham's railway station closed down in 1963, and there's little trace of it to be found today. But if you want to visit Brixham by rail, your best bet is to get the train from Exeter to Paignton, and from there you'll find plenty of buses linking the two towns. We just caught a glimpse of Brixham's bus station there, situated between Fore Street and Middle Street, which we're now going to follow back towards the harbour, where we'll reach the end of our walk. But of course the harbour is where we started out, just beside the statue of William of Orange, who, after reaching London, was crowned as King William III of England, ruling alongside his wife and the daughter of James II, Mary. Now, as well as being crowned King and Queen of England, events in preceding centuries meant that William and Mary were also crowned as monarchs of Scotland and Ireland, although, as we mentioned, support for the new monarchs was much thinner among the Scottish and the Irish. In Scotland, there was widespread anger that James II, part of the Stuart dynasty, which originally came from Scotland, had been deposed from the throne, largely by way of English actions. Meanwhile, in majority Catholic Ireland, James II remained widely popular, having been pushing for greater Catholic tolerance during his reign. After initially fleeing to France, James travelled to Ireland to lead an armed campaign to retake the throne, although he ultimately lost in the war against William of Orange. So within a few years of landing here in Brixham, the former Dutch prince began to cement his control over his three kingdoms of England, Scotland and Ireland, although fierce Jacobite resistance, in support of reinstating James II and his family line to the throne, continued in Scotland in particular, and parts of Ireland, for decades afterwards. The Glorious Revolution is said to have got its name from the fact that it was relatively bloodless, and while that may have indeed been the case in England, events elsewhere weren't quite as simple. It's a complex piece of history which had a long-lasting impact, in many cases still reverberating to this day, but it's interesting to note how it all began in this picturesque seaside town in Devon. Strolling the streets of Brixham today, under the beautiful summer sun, you'd be hard-pressed to realise that this was the site of the last successful invasion of England. But that momentous event is just the tip of the iceberg when it comes to this town's illustrious history. With more than 1,000 years of heritage under its belt, Brixham is a truly fascinating town, home to far more stories than first meet the eye. Sadly though, as we return to the harbourside, it's here that we've reached the end of our tour of Brixham. Thank you so much for watching this video. I really hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you're looking forward to visiting Brixham for yourself sometime soon.